A steel scalpel in a fiery hell. Picture this. Summer, 1943. The endless steppes near Kursk. The air vibrates with the roar of thousands of engines. The earth burns under the tracks of steel giants. This isn't just a battle. It's a clash of two civilizations, two wills, two massive machines grinding against each other. In this hell, at treetop level, a ghostly, angular shadow appears. It doesn't look like the sleek Messerschmitts or the swift yaks. It's squat, awkward, like it was forged by a backwoods blacksmith from scrap armor. But there's something predatory about it, something tenacious. This is the Henschel Hs .129. The German soldiers, looking up with hope, called it the Buchsenöffner, the can opener. The Soviet tankers, watching in horror as their comrades were turned into burning coffins, hated it with a passion. This wasn't an airplane in the conventional sense. It was a flying tank killer, a flying anti-tank gun, the desperate Wehrmacht's answer to the hordes of Soviet T-34s that seemed invulnerable to regular bombs and guns. But why does this story matter to us today? Why are we, almost 80 years later, talking about this plane that many consider a failure? It's simple. This is a story about a brilliant idea killed by compromise. A bold vision shattered by the harsh reality of war. It's a lesson for anyone who thinks a single wonder weapon can decide the outcome of a battle. It's a story full of drama, engineering breakthroughs, and fatal flaws. And it begins not on the battlefield, but in the quiet offices of the Third Reich. The birth of an idea. Why did they need an armored midget? To understand the Henschel phenomenon, you have to mentally travel back to the mid-1930s. Nazi Germany is flexing its muscles. Its generals, studying the experience of World War I, conclude that the future lies in blitzkrieg, lightning war. In the heart of blitzkrieg is tank formations slicing through enemy defenses. But every coin has a flip side. What if the enemy has its own tanks? Lots of them. How do you support your own advancing troops and stop the enemies? Regular bombers weren't suitable. They worked on area targets from high altitudes. Dive bombers, like the famous Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, were effective but vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire and fighters. They needed a fundamentally new machine. Not a universal soldier, but a specialized killer. A sky sniper. So, in 1937, the Reich Ministry of Aviation, RLM, issued a technical specification that was truly revolutionary. It demanded a twin-engine attack, plane whose main job would be hunting tanks and fortifications on the front lines. The key requirements were heavy armor. The pilot had to be protected like a knight in armor from ground fire. Concentrated, lethal armament. Not just bombs, but cannons capable of piercing armor. 2 engines. For survivability. If one failed, you could hopefully limp home on the other. 2 companies answered the call, Focke-Wulf and Henschel. It was a clash of 2 philosophies. Focke-Wulf proposed a larger, more conventional aircraft. But the team of engineers led by the talented and ambitious Friedrich Nicholas at Henschel took a radical path. Economic context and analysis. Why did Germany take the risk? The order for a specialized attack plane wasn't just a whim of the generals. It was a necessary step in preparing for total war. The German economy, though growing rapidly, was already experiencing a deficit of strategic resources, non-ferrous metals, rubber, high-octane aviation fuel. Building universal aircraft was expensive and resource-intensive. The Henschel idea was to create a relatively cheap, mass-produced tank destroyer that could be built in large numbers, compensating with quantity and specialization. The calculation was that a single enemy tank destroyed by such a plane would be worth several times more than the Henschel itself. It was an attempt to find an economically efficient answer to the avalanche of armored vehicle production in the USSR, a potential the Germans were just beginning to grasp. Nicholas and his team envisioned not just an airplane. They envisioned an armored cocoon, a flying fortress the size of fighter. Their project, designated P.46, and later the proud name HS.129, was approved. The drama was beginning. The armored cocoon. Genius or madness? The first prototype, the HS.129V1, took its maiden flight on May 25, 1939. And from the very start, it was clear this was something unheard of. The design, inside the steel barrel. Put yourself in the pilot's seat. You approach the plane. It's low squat. You don't so much climb into the cockpit as you squeeze into it through a small hatch. The cockpit is tiny, so much so that pilots complained. To reach some switches, you had to lift your shoulder off the seat. Visibility? What visibility? Forward, you look through a small porthole of armor glass 75 millimeters thick. To the sides, narrow slits. This wasn't an airplane, it was a submarine in the sky. And herein lay the genius and simultaneous tragedy of Nicholas's design. The pilot's cockpit was a welded box of steel armor plates. Front and bottom, 12 millimeters of armor. Sides 6. This was protection any pilot of the era would envy. The pilot was protected like a gold bar in a safe. But the safe was cramped, stuffy, and practically blind. The fuselage had a unique, almost triangular cross-section. This was done so the pilot, albeit with difficulty, could see the ground directly ahead. For a ground attack aircraft flying at treetop level, this was critical. The heart and the Achilles heel, the curse of the engines. Now for the main problem that haunted the Henschel from its first to its last day. The engines. Initially, the A version used German Argus as 410 engines with 465 horsepower. The result? A complete failure. The plane was so overweight with armor that with these engines, it could barely fly. It was slow, clumsy, easy prey even for obsolete fighters. What to do? German industry couldn't offer suitable engines. So the engineers found what seemed like a brilliant solution. After the defeat of France in 1940, Germany captured spoils of war, including French 14-cylinder radial engines, the Gunome Rhone 14M, with 700 horsepower. Yes, it was a power boost, but it was also a curse. These engines turned out to be incredibly finicky. They were sensitive to dust, sand, and cold. And where did the Henschel fight? Right, on the Eastern Front. The dusty roads of Ukraine in summer, sandstorms in the steppes, bitter frosts near Moscow in winter. The Gunome Rhone engines failed constantly. Imagine, a pilot is heading for his target. He sees a column of Soviet tanks. He prepares to attack, and suddenly, one engine sputters and dies. And that's it. Attack aborted. The plane, already not known for its flight characteristics, became a target on one engine. It had to be abandoned or somehow miraculously nursed back to friendly lines. Economic context and analysis. The price of compromise. Using captured French engines is a prime example of the forced improvisation of the Nazi war economy. On one hand, it seemed like a brilliant move, using a defeated enemy's resources against the next. It saved time, effort, and resources of German factories, which could focus on producing engines for higher priority Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. But the downside was terrible. Supply chains for Gunome Rhone spare parts were complex and unreliable. Repair and maintenance required special training for mechanics and a separate logistics system. In the context of partisan warfare on supply lines and growing Allied bombing, delivering a needed part to a forward airfield could become a mission in itself. Saving money at the design stage resulted in colossal operational costs and, most importantly, low mission readiness. Some reports indicate that only 30 to 40% of all available Henschels were often ready for flight. The rest sat on the ground, waiting for parts or repairs. Isn't that a verdict for a combat machine? The evolution of a killer. From machine guns to a wonder gun. Despite all the problems, the Henschel was put into production, and it began its bloody work. But what to arm it with? Regular machine guns against a tank are like throwing peas at a wall. They needed something heavier. HS.129B-1, the Nutcracker. The first production models carried two regular 7.92mm machine guns and two 20mm cannons. This was armament for trucks, infantry, light armor. Against the front of a T-34, these guns were useless. But the Germans quickly found a solution. They created a system of add-on weapon packs called Rustsats. The plane could carry an extra cannon under the fuselage. First, it was the 30mm Mk-101. This was already a serious caliber. A special armor-piercing round with a tungsten core could punch through the armor of most tanks from low altitude. The can opener was getting its main tool. HS.129B2, the improved Surgeon. The model was improved. The machine guns were replaced with larger caliber, 13mm ones. And instead of the Mk-101 cannon, they started installing the faster firing and more powerful Mk-103. Now the pilot had a better chance of hitting a tank's weak spots, the sides, rear, or top of the turret. Effectiveness against armor increased sharply. German propaganda made impressive films showing Henschels setting Soviet tanks ablaze one after another. The morale effect was huge. HS.129B3, the Flying Papa, and here we come to the apex, the peak of this unusual aircraft's evolution, to its main trump card and at the same time its swan song. This is the version with the BK 7.5 cannon. Imagine this. Under the fuselage of this rather small plane, they hung a giant, absurd, monstrous 75mm cannon. It was an aviation version of the famous Pak-40 anti-tank gun, the daddy of all German anti-tank guns. Its shell weighed several kilograms and, from a range of a few hundred meters, could pierce the armor of any Soviet tank. The frontal armor of an IS-2? No problem. The turret of a KV? Like a hot knife through butter. This was the ultimate 100% killer. But, as is often the case with ultimate weapons, it came with a terrible price. My opinion and analysis: the drama of the flying gun. As someone fascinated by the history of technology, this modification makes me think about the very concept of a wonder weapon. The creation of the HS.129B3 was an act of desperation. The Germans saw that the Soviet tank armies were only getting stronger, while their own air force was losing air superiority. And they went to an extreme. Yes, the BK 7.5 was incredibly powerful, but it had a meager ammunition supply, only 12, maybe 13 rounds. Imagine the pressure on the pilot. He knew he only had 1 or 2 attempts. Miss, and you're useless. You're flying back to base with an empty gun, a heavy, clumsy target for Soviet Yaks and Lavochkins. The recoil when firing was so monstrous that the plane literally stopped dead in the air. The pilot had to correct for this kick, or he would simply miss. This wasn't an airplane. It was a flying artillery piece. Genius? Absolutely. Effective? In isolated instances, yes. But as a weapons system capable of turning the tide of the war? No. It was a dead-end path. A beautiful, terrifying, but dead-end path. Combat service. Highs, lows, and the can opener nickname. The Henschel entered service in April 1942. Its combat path is a story of tactical successes and strategic failure. The Eastern Front, the can opener's finest hour. It was here, on the vast expanses of the USSR, that the HS.129 found its niche. It was ideal for attacking columns on the march, concentrations of vehicles, when Soviet units hadn't had time to deploy dense anti-aircraft defenses. Attack pilots developed their own tactics. Sneak in at treetop level, using the terrain, and deliver a surprise strike to the sides or rear of the tanks, where the armor was thinner. The peak of its fame came at the Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943. Hundreds of Henschels with 30mm and 75mm guns fell upon the Soviet tank spearheads. They inflicted painful losses. Reports from Soviet commanders repeatedly mentioned phrases like losses from enemy aircraft, tank disabled by an air attack. In those days, the nickname Buchsenöffner, can opener, became official and deserved. North Africa, failure in the sand. But in Africa, the Henschel was a complete flop. It was sent there in November 1942. And what happened? The finicky French engines, which couldn't handle dust, failed one after another in the conditions of the Sahara Desert. Sand filters didn't help. Henschel units in Africa suffered monstrous non-combat losses. By the time the German-Italian forces capitulated in Tunisia in May 1943, not a single serviceable HS.129 remained. They were all abandoned or destroyed by their own crews because they couldn't be evacuated. The decline. when the sky became hostile. After Kursk, the dark days began for the Henschel. Soviet anti-aircraft defenses grew stronger every month. Anti-aircraft guns with radar guidance appeared, and air superiority was gradually seized by new generation Soviet fighters, the La-5, Yak-9. The slow, clumsy Henschel became easy prey for them. By mid-1944, losses among Henschel pilots reached 20%. This is a catastrophic figure. Training a new attack pilot is difficult and time-consuming. The elite, experienced pilots who knew how to approach a target and hit it accurately were dying one after another. It was impossible to replace these losses. Henschel squadrons melted away before their eyes. The plane, created for offense, was forced to defend. And in defense, it was helpless. Production and legacy. A lesson paid for in blood. Production of the HS.129 continued from June 1940 to September 1944. In total, 871 serial aircraft were built, a number that, by World War II standards, is more than modest. For comparison, over 36,000 Soviet Il-2 Sturmovik attack planes were built. So, was the Henschel a success? Yes, if you look at the idea. It was the world's first specialized anti-tank aircraft. It proved that such a concept had a right to exist. Its tactics became a textbook for subsequent generations of attack aircraft. No, if you look at the execution, chronically weak and unreliable engines, poor visibility, vulnerability to fighters, all of this prevented it from reaching its potential. It was a one-trick pony, and when the frontline conditions changed, it couldn't adapt. Economic context and analysis, the final cost. From an economic standpoint, the HS.129 project is hard to call efficient. Vast resources, scarce steel, aluminum, the labor of engineers and workers, were spent on creating a machine that, due to its design flaws, could not exert strategic influence. The same Il-2, for all its faults, was a true workhorse of the war, produced in the tens of thousands, and contributed decisively to victory at the tactical level. The Henschel remained a niche weapon that failed to become mainstream. War is always about economics. And in this economic duel, the Third Reich lost. The Henschel lost with it. A ghost over the battlefield. A lesson for the future. Today, not a single airworthy HS.129 survives. Only rusty wreckage raised by recovery teams from old battlefields, and a few replicas in museums. It has become a ghost, a legend. But its legacy lives on. The idea of a heavily armored tank hunter attack plane, armed with a super powerful cannon, did not die. The principles laid down by Nicholas can be seen in the American 8-10 Thunderbolt II, whose main GU-8 cannon is a direct spiritual descendant of the BK 7.5, and the Soviet Su-25 Frogfoot, whose armored cockpit and survivability became its hallmark. The story of the Henschel HS.129 is an eternal lesson. A lesson that a brilliant idea, unsupported by a reliable technological base, is doomed. That there are no simple solutions in war, and a single wonder gun cannot replace sound strategy, mass production, and reliable logistics. It's the story of how engineering genius collided with the grim truth of war, and lost. But even in its defeat, it left us, the descendants, an invaluable experience paid for with the blood of thousands. All right, folks, that's a wrap on our story for today. But the discussion is just getting started. What do you think? Was the Henschel a genius machine ahead of its time, or a dead end in aviation evolution? Could it have changed the course of the war under different circumstances? Or was its fate sealed from the start? I need you to drop your opinion in the comments below. Your point of view is extremely important to me. We'll definitely feature the most interesting comments in our next video. And of course, if you enjoyed this, if you learned something new, support the channel. Hit that like button, share this with your buddies, and subscribe so you don't miss our next investigations. This is channel host name, signing off. Catch you next time in the world of amazing history.